I worked at a convenience store in college. One of my coworkers was a slightly older guy named Rob. He was pretty chill, and we hung out a bit outside of the store, mainly because our shifts overlapped. I worked the late night to early morning slot, while he did the graveyard shift from 2 a.m. to 8 a.m. One quiet night, the kind where the only sounds are the hum of the fridges and the occasional distant car on the highway, Rob started telling me about the peculiar things he'd noticed during his solitary hours. He always seemed a bit off when he spoke about the night, a mix of fascination and unease in his voice. Sometimes, Rob said, his voice barely above a whisper as if he didn't want the empty store to hear, you can feel like you're not alone, even though you know you are. It's like the silence has weight to it. That night, after Rob left, I experienced what he was talking about. The silence felt oppressive, almost tangible. I was alone, the store was locked, and there were no customers. Yet every small noise made me jump. The tick of the clock, the occasional pop from the cooling system, the distant sound of a train that wasn't supposed to pass by at this hour. At about 4 a.m., the lights flickered. Not just a flicker, but a series of blinks that seemed deliberate, like Morse code. I tried to convince myself it was just an electrical issue, but the rhythmic pattern made my skin crawl. Then there was the customer, or what I thought was one. Around 5 a.m. I saw someone through the glass doors. It was too dark outside, and the figure was just a silhouette, but I could tell they were tall, unnaturally so. I waited for them to approach, but they just stood there, motionless, for what seemed like an eternity. My heart was pounding, and I decided to check the surveillance monitor. The screen showed no one outside. When I looked back up, the figure was gone. After that night, I started noticing other things. Sometimes I'd hear whispering from the back room, but upon checking, I'd find no one. The radio would play static at odd times, no matter how many times I changed the station. And there was this one customer, an old man with hollow eyes, who came in every night at exactly 3:47 a.m. He never bought anything, just stood at the counter, staring, until I asked if he needed help, at which point he'd leave without a word. Rob, when I mentioned these incidents, just gave me a knowing look. You start to see things, or maybe it's just your mind playing tricks. The night has a way of making you question what's real. The final straw came one night when I was closing up. I felt a presence behind me as I was counting the till. Turning around, there was no one, but the air felt thick with someone else's breath. The lights flickered again, and in that brief darkness, I swore I saw a shadow move when no one should have been there. I didn't quit, but I never worked the night shift alone again. And Rob? He moved on to another job, but sometimes I wonder if he ever truly left that store, or if part of him stayed. Maybe that part of him is watching over the night with a quiet, knowing unease. I did overnight stock work for a few years in a larger grocery store. The night shift was always eerily quiet, with only the hum of the refrigeration units and the distant echo of the stocking carts moving through the aisles. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, casting strange shadows that played tricks on your mind after hours of solitude. One night, as I was restocking the canned goods, I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was subtle at first, like someone tapping their nails on a countertop. I paused, listening intently. The sound was coming from the far end of the cereal aisle, where the lights were dimmer and the shadows were deeper. My pulse quickened for a moment, but then I chalked it up to the building settling. I moved on, but the tapping followed me to the next aisle, growing slightly louder and more insistent. I peered down the aisle, expecting to see a coworker or perhaps someone from the cleaning crew, but there was no one. Just rows upon rows of cereal boxes, some boxes askew as if they had been recently disturbed. I felt a chill, not from the cold of the freezer section nearby, but from an inexplicable unease. That unease turned into near paranoia when I started noticing things out of place. A single can of soup would be on the floor in an aisle I had just cleared. A box of pasta would be turned the wrong way, or the label facing inward as if someone had hastily put it back. I checked the security cameras, but would only ever see myself or my colleagues doing their job, nothing out of the ordinary. Then there was the time with the new guy, Mark. He was thin, with dark circles under his eyes that made him look perpetually tired. He'd often mutter to himself, or stare blankly into space. One shift, after everyone else had gone home and it was just the two of us, I found him standing motionless in the dairy section, his eyes fixed on the milk cartons. "Mark?" I called out, my voice echoing slightly in the empty store. He didn't respond at first, then slowly turned to face me, his expression blank. "They're always watching," he whispered, his eyes darting around as if expecting to see something in the shadows. "Who's watching?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "The shadows," he said in a hushed tone. "They move when you're not looking directly at them." I laughed it off, told him he needed more sleep, but his words stuck with me. Over the next few shifts, I began noticing shadows that seemed too long, shapes that didn't quite fit where they should. I told myself it was just my imagination, fatigue playing tricks. Then one morning, the final straw came. It was just before the sun rose. I was in the back, organizing stock, when I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I expected to see one of the early morning staff, but the aisle was empty. The footsteps continued, growing louder and faster, as if someone was running towards me, yet no one appeared. That was my last night. I quit, telling my manager I couldn't handle the night shift anymore. He nodded like he understood, but his eyes held a story he wasn't telling. Sometimes, when I'm shopping during the day, I catch glimpses of the night crew, their faces pale under the harsh lights, their movements quick and furtive. And I swear, now and then, I hear a faint tapping, like nails on glass, and I wonder what really lurks in the quiet of the night. I've been a trauma nurse for 20 years, and I've done my share of night shifts. But none quite like the one at St. Margaret's Hospital, where the night shift was more than just a battle against sleep, it was a test of sanity. It was a Thursday, unusually quiet for a hospital nestled in the heart of a bustling city. The ER had been eerily still since midnight, with only the occasional drunk or a minor injury case breaking the silence. My shift partner, Mike, a seasoned ER doctor, was catching up on some paperwork while I took a moment to rest my eyes in the break room. Around 3 a.m., the quiet was shattered by the shrill ring of the phone. Mike answered, his voice calm and collected, but his face told a different story. "Code Blue, incoming," he announced as he hung up. Within minutes, the ambulance arrived with a man, unconscious, his breath shallow. The paramedics reported he was found wandering incoherently in an alley. As we worked on him, stabilizing his vitals, something about the situation felt off. His eyes, even when they were closed, seemed to follow us around the room. Then the shift took a darker turn. The lights flickered intermittently, not enough to fail, but just enough to cast eerie, shifting shadows across the walls. Equipment started to malfunction. Monitors would beep erratically for no reason, then suddenly stop. As I was charting, I heard whispers, soft, indistinct, like someone was just behind the door speaking in hushed tones. I checked the hallway. It was empty. Mike seemed to hear them too, but dismissed it as the fatigue playing tricks on our minds. The patient, now stable but still unconscious, began to murmur in his sleep. His words were slurred and nonsensical, but one phrase repeated, "He's watching." We couldn't shake the chill that followed those words. The shift was nearing its end when the most unsettling event occurred. The security cameras, installed after a series of thefts, began to show static. When they cleared, for a brief moment, they captured a figure not in the frame before, a shadow, too dark, too still, in the corridor outside our patient's room. When security checked, there was no one there. Just the echo of our footsteps, the dim hospital lights, and the incessant drip of an IV. The sun rose, and with it, the spell of the night seemed to lift. Our patient woke up, confused but stable, unable to recall anything from the previous night except a vague sense of dread. As we handed over to the day shift, Mike and I exchanged a look. There were things in the night that we couldn't explain, not with science or not with logic anyway. Just the unsettling feeling of eyes watching from the shadows, the whispers of something unseen, and a figure that shouldn't have been there. That night at St. Margaret's, we learned that sometimes the most terrifying things are not the ones we can see, but the ones we only feel. And sometimes it's the presence of something just beyond the edge of our perception. I do construction, and one time for a few weeks, my crew and I were doing overnight work on this highway. They started blocking off lanes at 8 p.m., and we'd get to work soon after that. It was the usual gig, patching up the road, replacing old signs, and general maintenance, but there was something off about this one particular stretch of road. The first night, everything seemed normal. The hum of the machinery, the distant glow of city lights, and the occasional cars speeding past on the open lanes. But as the nights wore on, a peculiar routine began to unfold. Every night, right around midnight, a truck would pull up at the far end of our work zone. It was an old model, rusty and loud, with its headlights dim and flickering. The driver would never get out. Instead, he would just sit there, engine idling, watching us work. At first we thought it was maybe a supervisor from some other department, or perhaps a safety inspector, but he never spoke to us, never even acknowledged our presence beyond watching. One night I finally decided to approach him. As I walked towards the truck, my heart rate picked up with each step. The closer I got, the more oppressive the silence became, broken only by the engine's growl. But as I neared, the truck suddenly roared to life and sped off, tires screeching, leaving behind only a cloud of exhaust. Days passed, and the truck became a regular visitor. My crew even started joking about it, calling it the Watcher. But even so, there was an unspoken agreement among us that the truck was eerie. Then came the night of the storm. Rain was pouring down in sheets, and the wind howled like something out of a horror film. Only a skeleton crew was on site, including me and a new guy, Sam. We were setting up some cones when we heard the familiar engine sound, but this time it was louder, as if the truck was closer than usual. Through the rain we saw the headlights, but they weren't coming from the end of the road this time. They were on the closed lane, right where we were working. Sam and I exchanged a look of confusion and fear. The truck was moving slowly, its lights casting long, distorted shadows in the water on the asphalt. We could see the silhouette of the driver, but the face was obscured by the heavy downpour. We shouted for it to stop, but the truck kept advancing, the lights blinding us now. Sam, panicking, ran towards our equipment while I stood frozen. At the last moment, the truck swerved, narrowly missing him, and then it was gone. The truck simply vanished into the storm as if it had never been there. After that, the truck didn't return, but the incident did leave us all uneasy. The rest of the job was completed in a tense silence, each of us casting glances into the darkness, expecting at any moment to see those dim headlights again. The highway was fixed, but none of us could shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there, that the Watcher might still be out there somewhere, watching from the shadows and waiting. For a while in my mid-20s, I worked as a private security guard. Very rarely did anything even remotely dangerous happen, but there was one thing I still can't explain to this day. I was doing overnight patrols for these new luxury apartments that were being built on a beach. The construction was almost finished, but the place was still empty, just echoing with the sound of the ocean and the occasional gust of wind through the skeletal structures. My shift started at 11 p.m., and I would walk through the half-built corridors, my flashlight beam dancing over steel beams and through empty window frames. The first few nights were uneventful, filled with the mundane checks of temporary fences and locks that never needed resecuring. However, around my third week, things began to feel off. It started subtly, a whisper of movement when I knew I was alone, or a shadow that seemed to linger just out of the corner of my eye. The construction site, usually just a backdrop for the roaring sea, started to feel like it was watching me. One night, as I was checking the perimeter, I noticed the security cameras were all pointed inward, not outwards towards potential intruders. I thought it was odd, but maybe someone had adjusted them by mistake. I corrected them, but the next night they were back in their inward-facing position. The eerie part came during a particularly stormy night. The wind was howling and the rain was pelting down, sounding like it was trying to get inside the buildings. I was making my rounds when I heard voices. Not the kind you'd expect from a late-night worker or radio playing in the distance. These were hushed, almost like whispers, but they carried a tone of urgency. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, the flashlight beam shaking slightly in my grip. The voices led me to the top floor, where the structure was most open to the elements. There, in the middle of the concrete slab that would one day be someone's luxury living room, stood a figure. It was a man, dressed in what looked like old-fashioned clothes, not modern attire. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing the ocean, his back to me. I called out, "Hey, you can't be here," but there was no response, not even a twitch. I approached cautiously, my radio in one hand, ready to call for backup. As I got closer, the man turned slowly. His face was blank, expressionless, his eyes hollow. But what chilled me to the bone wasn't his appearance, it was the utter silence. The wind, the rain, everything had stopped, and the only sound was my own breathing. I blinked, and he was gone. The weather returned with a vengeance, as if it had been holding its breath. I searched the area, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no damp clothes left behind, nothing. The next day I checked the footage from the security cameras. There was no one on the top floor at the time I saw him, just an empty space, the rain, and my flashlight's beam sweeping the area. I never found out who or what that man was. The construction workers said no one was supposed to be there, especially not in those old clothes. The incident was never explained, and the unsettling feeling never left. Nights on that site always felt like someone was just out of sight, watching and waiting. And every now and then, on a stormy night, I swear I can still hear those whispered voices, urging me to look, but never telling me what to find. I used to work at this fast food place and would calmly do the drive-thru. The night shift was always a bit eerie, with the dim lighting and the way the shadows played across the walls, making everything seem larger or smaller than life. It was around 2 a.m., the graveyard shift, when the streets outside were practically deserted except for the occasional car with its headlights slicing through the darkness. The other crew members were minimal tonight. It was just me, the cook, and another cashier named Mike, who was more of a loner type, always keeping to himself in the back, muttering things under his breath. The first unsettling thing happened when a car pulled up in the drive-thru. The voice that came through the speaker was raspy, almost like it belonged to someone who hadn't spoken in years. "Just a coffee, black," it said. I glanced at the camera feed, but the image was distorted by static. Shrugging it off as old equipment, I prepared the coffee. When I handed it out, no one was there to take it. I checked around, but the car was gone, vanished into the night without even the sound of its engine fading away. Mike didn't seem to notice or care, and he just continued his muttering. I tried to shake off the chill, convincing myself it was just a prank or someone who changed their mind at the last second. As the night wore on, the silence was oppressive, punctuated only by the hum of the kitchen equipment and the occasional sizzle from the grill. Then, the radio, which usually played pop tunes to keep the mood light, started picking up static and bits of conversation. It wasn't the usual chatter of truckers or late-night travelers, but rather snippets of deep, worried voices discussing things that didn't make sense. Mentions of the experiment and it's getting closer. The next oddity came with the customer who didn't look quite right. His features were normal, but his movements were off, like he was slightly out of sync with reality. He ordered food, but when I handed it over, he just stared at me, his eyes unblinking, until he finally whispered, "Thank you," in a way that felt like a warning. The night continued with these eerie moments. The clock seemed to mock me, its ticking growing louder, as if time itself was warping around us. Mike, who had been quiet, suddenly burst out with, "They're watching us, you know, always watching." Before I could even respond, he went back to his usual quiet, leaving me to ponder if he was just losing grip on reality, or if there was something more sinister at play. The drive-thru camera flickered, and for a moment, I swear I saw someone, or something, standing just outside the frame, watching us. As dawn approached, the shadows receded, and the world outside began to wake. The sense of unease lingered, though. I left that night wondering what exactly happens in the deep hours when the world sleeps, and now, every time I pass by a late-night drive-thru, I can't help but feel a shiver, wondering about the secrets whispered in the static of the night. For a while in my early 20s, I worked as an on-call delivery driver for a medical supply company. I'm not even sure why they offered deliveries at night, as there practically weren't any to be made, and it's not like we could help customers who were having emergencies anyway. It didn't matter though, because I wasn't going to turn down super easy money. Most of the time I'd hang out in the break room, watching stuff on the TV, reading, or playing this odd collection of games on the console that someone left there. It was called the Sega Saturn, which I guess was something Sega made back when they made consoles. I remember there were these two games where you were some kind of cartoon insect, a game where you were a clockwork knight and every other toy was trying to kill you, and this racing game. Over the few years I worked there, I played a fair amount of them, and now they're actually kind of nostalgic. Anyway, one night, the usual routine was broken by a call. It was around 3 a.m., the witching hour for anyone working the night shift. The call was from a voice I didn't recognize, raspy and slightly out of breath. They needed a delivery to an address I never heard of, on the outskirts of town where the streetlights were sparse and the shadows seemed thicker. I packed up the supplies, a few boxes of bandages, some saline solutions, and other non-emergency items, and then set out. The drive was eerie to say the least, the road surrounded by nothing but fields and the occasional decrepit barn. The only sound was the hum of my car's engine and the occasional static from my radio, which was now picking up nothing but white noise. Arriving at the address, it was an old warehouse, the kind that looked abandoned but had one light on, flickering sporadically. I knocked, and after a moment, the door creaked open slightly. There stood a thin, pale man with eyes that seemed too large for his face, like he hadn't slept in weeks. He muttered something about needing the supplies for experiments, his voice trailing off into a whisper that made my skin crawl. I handed over the boxes, trying to keep my professional demeanor, but my curiosity and unease got the better of me. "What kind of experiments?" I asked, half expecting silence. He smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, just work for the betterment of humanity," he replied, his voice now clear, but somehow more unsettling for it. As I turned to leave, my foot caught something. Looking down, I saw an old, dusty medical textbook with diagrams of human anatomy that looked disturbingly detailed. I didn't want to think about where the information from those diagrams came from. Driving back, the silence of the night seemed to press in around me. Every shadow on the road looked like it might hide something sinister. My mind replayed the man's face, his eerie smile, and the coldness in his voice when he spoke of his work. Back at the break room, I tried to shake it off by diving back into the games, but the night's encounter lingered, making each sound from the building, each flicker of the lights, feel like a warning. From then on, every call that came in at night felt like it might lead to another unsettling encounter, and the break room, with its outdated games, became less an escape and more a reminder of the eerie world that existed just beyond the warehouse's walls. I work in a commercial phlebotomy lab where we collect patients' blood for various medical tests. I usually volunteer to do the late shift, since there's fewer patients then, and I don't mind working odd hours. Most times there's one other lady who works with me, Rosa, and she mostly watches her soap operas on the TV in the waiting room. Tonight, however, Rosa called in sick, leaving me alone for the first time. The lab has always had an eerie vibe at night, with fluorescent lights buzz overhead, and the silence is so deep it feels like the entire world has gone to sleep, leaving just me in the shadows. Around midnight, the phone rang, shattering the silence. It was an automated reminder for a blood draw, but the voice seemed to stutter, repeating the last digit of the patient number several times. I shrugged it off as a glitch, but it set an uneasy tone. As the night wore on, I started hearing what sounded like footsteps in the hallway outside the lab. Curious and a bit alarmed, I peeked out. The corridor was empty, the long, sterile hallway stretching out with doors to examination rooms on either side, all closed. The security cameras showed no movement, yet the footsteps returned every now and then, each time stopping just outside our lab door. To distract myself, I turned on the TV Rosa usually watches. Instead of her soaps, though, there was static, and for a brief moment I thought I saw a silhouette of someone sitting in one of the waiting room chairs. I blinked and it was gone, but the image stuck with me, unsettling me further. Later, I decided to check the lab's voicemail for any last-minute appointments. One message was from a patient who was supposed to come in earlier that day but never showed. His voice was low, almost a whisper, and he kept saying, I'm still here, over and over, until the message abruptly cut off. The air conditioning kicked in with a loud hum, making the lab colder than usual. My breath started to fog in front of me, which was strange because the AC was never that powerful before. I wrapped my lab coat tighter around me, feeling a chill seep into my bones. Then there was the matter of the blood samples. I had left them on the countertop to be catalogued later, but when I went back, one of the vials was uncapped, the blood slightly congealed. There was no logical explanation for it, though. I was the only one there. As the shift neared its end, the power flickered, the lights dimming momentarily before coming back with a flicker. My heart raced, and I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. I checked the cameras again, but there was nothing. However, it was then that I noticed something I hadn't before. The date on the security footage was wrong. It showed a date from 2 weeks ago. The final straw was when I went to log off the computer system. Instead of the usual logout screen, a message flashed, "Don't leave me here alone again." The exact moment I read it, the screen returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. I shut everything down quickly, locked up, and left, the echo of my footsteps sounding too loud in the empty building. The morning shift found no evidence of anything amiss, but from that night on, I never volunteered for the late shift again. I also always made sure there was someone else with me. The silence of the lab at night had become a companion to something I couldn't explain, and something that, perhaps, was better left undisturbed.